I'm Henny B, and welcome to the World War I Stories podcast, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. Some scenes in these stories may be too graphic for sensitive listeners, so listener discretion is advised. Today's episode, The Shadow of War. The borough of Brooklyn, New York buzzed with excitement on the morning of April 6, 1917. War had just been declared on Germany, and no one seemed more thrilled than Elijah Thompson. Just over a month earlier, it had been revealed that a German official named Zimmerman had promised Mexico territory in exchange for keeping America occupied and out of European affairs. Despite President Woodrow Wilson's commitment to keeping America neutral, the revelation of Zimmerman's telegram had thrust the nation headlong into war. This had ignited a fervor among young men like Elijah, who was the son of a carpenter and a seamstress. Having just turned 18, he felt a burning desire to carve out his place in the world, and he, along with many other patriotic American boys, decided to join the army. Elijah's parents had migrated north the previous year, seeking better opportunities and respite from the oppressive Jim Crow laws of their native Georgia. In New York, Elijah's father found steady work thanks to the city's ongoing growth, while the increasing population kept his mother busy as well. Despite the challenges they faced, Elijah was determined to make the most of their new life. As he walked through the bustling streets, the energy of the city fueled his ambition, and he felt ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. "Elijah, are you sure about this?" his mother asked one evening, her sewing needle pausing mid-stitch. Concern etched her brow. "The world is dangerous out there." "Yes, I'm sure, Ma," Elijah replied firmly, determination in his voice. "Something about it just feels like the right thing to do." "Now, Elijah, you do understand that you're different, right?" his mother interjected, her tone shifting to one of caution. "You mean I'm black, right?" Elijah asked, a hint of defiance in his voice. "Yes, son, and the army ain't no different than the real world. If you think you're going to be treated better just because you're wearing a uniform, you best think again," she said, her voice steady but laced with worry. "Ma, I'm already treated that way if I leave the borough. What's the difference?" Elijah shot back, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. His mother shrugged her shoulders, returning to her sewing, the needle moving rhythmically as if to distract herself from the conversation. Elijah's father, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "Elijah," he began, his voice heavy with experience, "we've been treated like second-class citizens in this country since we were born, and you want to go fight for them? To die for them?" "Pa, it's not for them. It's for the people of Europe," Elijah insisted, his passion igniting. "I've been reading, and they don't treat people like us over there the way they do here. And besides, what better way to show this country we belong than to fight for it?" The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Elijah's father leaned back in his chair, his eyes searching his son's face for any sign of doubt. "Well, son, you're 18 now, and, well, you don't really need my blessing. But you have it. But I tell you now, don't get used to the good treatment over there, because that treatment won't follow you back no matter how brave you are, what rank you are, and what medals you earn. Your skin has already decided how you're treated here." Elijah nodded, a mix of determination and resignation in his eyes. He knew his father was right, but he also felt a burning desire to prove himself, to show that he could rise above the constraints placed upon him by society. The next morning, Elijah woke up before dawn. The air was crisp and the city was still wrapped in the quiet of the early morning hours. He dressed in his best clothes and took in the atmosphere of the modest apartment that had been home since they moved from Georgia. "Ma, Pa, I'm headed out," he called softly, not wanting to wake his younger siblings. His mother appeared in the doorway, her eyes red from a sleepless night. She pulled him into a tight embrace. "Be safe, Elijah, and remember, no matter what, you make us proud." "I will, Ma," he whispered, holding back his own tears. His father stood a few steps behind, his expression stern but his eyes betraying his true feelings. "Take care, son, and remember what I told you." Elijah nodded, gripping his father's hand firmly. I will, Pa. As he walked down the street towards the recruitment office, Elijah felt a mixture of fear and excitement. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was determined to face whatever came his way with courage and honor. The recruitment office was already bustling with activity. Young men from all walks of life were lined up, eager to enlist. Elijah joined the line, standing tall and proud. He noticed a few curious glances, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the path he had chosen. When it was his turn, the recruiter looked him over with a critical eye. Name? He asked. Elijah Thompson, he replied confidently. Age? 18. The recruiter scribbled down his answers, then looked up. Why do you want to join the army, son? Elijah took a deep breath. To fight for freedom and justice, sir, and to prove that I belong. The recruiter raised an eyebrow, but said nothing more. He handed Elijah a form to fill out and directed him to the next station. As Elijah completed the necessary paperwork and underwent the physical examination, a growing sense of purpose welled up inside him. This was his chance to make a difference, to prove to the world and to himself what he was capable of. By the end of the day, Elijah was officially a soldier in the United States Army. He knew the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, both on the battlefield and within the ranks, but he was ready to face them head on, driven by a fierce determination to carve out his place in the world and honor the sacrifices of those who came before him. As he turned to leave the recruitment office, Elijah addressed the nearest recruiter. Nobody told me when I leave, sir. The recruiter looked him up and down, a hint of amusement in his eyes. You can leave now if you want. Well, now's as good a time as any. Show me the way, sir, Elijah replied, his excitement bubbling over. The recruiter handed him directions to the bus station along with a fresh ticket. With a sense of urgency, Elijah walked briskly to the station, each step bringing him closer to a new destiny. With a final glance back at the city he called home, Elijah Thompson boarded the bus, ready to embark on a new adventure, one that would test his limits and shape his future in ways he could have never imagined. He was off to Camp Wadsworth in South Carolina, the Deep South. The bus ride to South Carolina was long and arduous. As the miles passed, Elijah couldn't help but reflect on his parents' words. He knew the South held its own set of challenges, but he was determined to face them. The landscape changed gradually from the bustling cityscape of Brooklyn to the rolling hills and verdant fields of the rural South. The further south they went, the more Elijah felt the weight of his decision. When the bus finally pulled into the station near Camp Wadsworth, Elijah stepped off, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. The air was thick with humidity and the sun beat down relentlessly. He gathered his belongings and made his way to the camp, following the directions he had been given. Camp Wadsworth was a sprawling military installation, buzzing with the activity of new recruits and seasoned soldiers alike. Elijah reported to the registration office, where a stern-faced officer directed him to his barracks. As he walked through the camp, he noticed the segregated facilities and the wary glances from some of the white soldiers. He had expected this, but it still stung. Elijah was assigned to an all-black regiment, the 369th Infantry, also known as the Harlem Hellfighters. The regiment was composed of men from various backgrounds, all brought together by a common purpose. Elijah quickly found camaraderie among his fellow soldiers, many of whom had faced similar challenges and shared his determination to prove themselves. Training was grueling. The days were long and filled with drills, physical conditioning, and lessons in military strategy. Elijah pushed himself to the limit, driven by the desire to excel. His fellow soldiers recognized his dedication and began to look up to him as a natural leader. One evening, as the sun set over the camp, Elijah sat with a group of his comrades, sharing stories and laughter. Among them was Corporal James Richards, a seasoned soldier with a wealth of experience. Elijah, you ever think about what comes after all this? James asked, gesturing to the camp around them. Elijah thought for a moment before replying. I try not to dwell on it too much. Right now, I'm focused on doing my best here. But I hope that when this war is over, things will be different for us. Maybe they'll see what we're capable of and treat us with the respect we deserve. James nodded, a somber expression on his face. I hope so too. And remember, change comes slow. We may have to keep fighting even after all the battles are over. One warm afternoon in the summer of 1917, Elijah and a few of his fellow soldiers decided to venture into Spartanburg for a brief respite from the rigors of training. They had heard about a small diner that served hearty meals, and the prospect of a good meal was too tempting to pass up. "Think they'll serve us?" one of his friends asked as they ventured out of the confines of the base. "We'll find out," Elijah replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. As they walked into town, dressed in their crisp military uniforms, they couldn't help but notice the curious and sometimes hostile stares from some of the local white residents. Elijah tried to ignore the glares and focus on the camaraderie with his friends. They reached the diner, and as they stepped inside, the chatter among the patrons abruptly ceased. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. The soldiers approached the counter, and the waitress, a middle-aged white woman, looked at them with a mix of apprehension and disdain. "We don't serve your kind here," she said coldly, her voice breaking the silence. Elijah felt a surge of anger but kept his composure. "We're soldiers, ma'am, just like any other," he replied politely, hoping to appeal to her sense of fairness. A man at a nearby table, dressed in a worn-out suit and fedora, stood up and approached them. "You heard the lady. Get out," he said with a sneer, his hand resting on his belt as if ready for a confrontation. Elijah's friends started to back towards the door, sensing the situation could escalate quickly. Elijah, however, stood his ground for a moment longer. "We're here to fight for this country, just like everyone else," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Not in this town, you're not," the man retorted. "Now get out, before there's trouble." Seeing no other option, Elijah and his friends left the diner, their stomachs empty but their resolve hardened. As they walked back to the camp, the weight of the encounter hung heavily in the air. They had hoped that wearing the uniform of the United States Army might shield them from some of the worst of the racial prejudice, but reality had swiftly and harshly reminded them otherwise. Back at Camp Wadsworth, Elijah sat on his bunk, reflecting on the day's events. "We deserve better than this," he muttered to himself, feeling a mix of frustration and determination. The discrimination and hostility they faced in Spartanburg only fueled his desire to prove his worth on the battlefield. He knew that the fight for equality was not just overseas, but also right at home. Elijah resolved to carry the pride and resilience of his heritage into the war, to show that courage and valor knew no color. The days at Camp Wadsworth continued, each one blending into the next with grueling drills and relentless training. Despite the challenges, Elijah and his comrades grew stronger, both physically and mentally. The camaraderie among the soldiers was unbreakable, and they relied on each other for support and encouragement. As the months passed, the 369th Infantry Regiment was finally called to action. They would be deployed to France, where the Great War raged with an intensity that none of them could yet comprehend. The men were eager to prove their mettle and to fight for a country that still struggled to recognize their full humanity. "France, huh?" one of his friends mused as they ate their dinner. "I wonder what it's like over there." "Don't know," Elijah replied, "but I do know we'll show them what we're made of." 2 weeks later, the regiment was transported back to New York on a convoy of buses, preparing for their departure to Europe. The following week, Elijah stepped onto the dock and admired the ship they were set to depart on before boarding. The vessel, a large troop transport, was crowded with men and supplies, the air thick with the scent of salt water and diesel. As the ship pulled away from the dock, Elijah watched the New York skyline fade into the distance, replaced by the vast, seemingly endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The journey was long and fraught with danger. Since the United States had joined the war effort, German U-boats had been patrolling the waters, posing a constant threat. These submarines, notorious for launching surprise torpedo attacks, forced the soldiers to remain on high alert throughout the voyage. The ship zigzagged to avoid detection, and the men spent many sleepless nights wary of the unseen enemy below. Despite the palpable tension, their resolve never wavered. They held fast to the hope that their mission was just and their cause noble. One night, the eerie wail of the ship's alarm pierced the darkness, waking Elijah from a dead sleep. He and the other soldiers scrambled to their stations, adrenaline coursing through their veins. "U-boat spotted!" a crew member shouted, his voice barely audible over the clamor. Elijah's heart pounded as he stood at his position. Depth charges were deployed, exploding in the water with deafening roars. The ship rocked violently, but the evasive maneuvers worked, and the U-boat eventually retreated. That was close, Elijah's friend whispered, his face pale. Too close, Elijah agreed, feeling a surge of relief as the immediate danger passed. After what felt like an eternity, the shores of France came into view. Elijah and the others disembarked and lined up in formation along the dock as commanded. Welcome to Brest, France. Take a good look around, gentlemen, for it'll be a while before you see civilization again, bellowed a stout man they had never seen before. The man here next to me is Captain Henri Guerrier of the French 4th Army Corps. He will be your liaison officer. The stout man then stepped aside to reveal a tall, slender man in a blue tunic. It is an honor to have you join us in the fight against Hun tyranny, he said in a heavily accented English. Now, please follow me to the muster point. We will meet other Sammies there and march to the front lines, he continued. As they began to march, the soldier next to Elijah asked, Why are we with the French? Because our army is still segregated, remember? They don't want us. Apparently, the French do, Elijah answered. After 3 days of marching and sleeping outdoors, they reached a supply trench where they were told to form a line to be assigned gear. Elijah was pleasantly surprised when he was issued a Berthier rifle with a 3-cartridge magazine. He had never seen a finer rifle than this. Elijah was then guided to a forward trench where he was to await further orders. You boys are a sight for sore eyes, a French officer remarked as he greeted them. We've been expecting you for weeks. Elijah nodded in acknowledgement, feeling a mix of pride and apprehension. The French officer's warm welcome was a stark contrast to the uncertainty that lay ahead. The men settled into the forward trench, taking in their new surroundings. The air was thick with the smell of earth and gunpowder, and the distant sound of artillery fire served as a constant reminder of the ongoing conflict. As night fell, Elijah found a moment to reflect. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the training and the camaraderie he had built with his fellow soldiers. The Berthier rifle in his hands felt reassuring, a symbol of his readiness and determination. The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the fog, Captain Henri Guerrier returned with new orders. Gentlemen, he began, today we will join our French comrades in a reconnaissance mission. We need to gather intelligence on enemy positions and fortifications. This is a crucial task, and I trust you all to carry it out with the utmost precision. Elijah and his squad nodded in unison. They quickly prepared their gear, checking their rifles and ensuring they had enough ammunition. The tension was palpable, but so was the sense of purpose. As they moved out of the trench and into the open field, Elijah's heart raced. The landscape was a desolate expanse of mud, barbed wire, and craters from countless explosions. They advanced cautiously, using whatever cover they could find. Suddenly, a burst of gunfire erupted from a nearby ridge. Take cover, shouted Sergeant Williams, the squad leader. Elijah dove behind a fallen tree, his mind racing. He could hear the bullets whizzing past, the shouts of his comrades, and the ever-present roar of artillery in the distance. Elijah, we need to flank them, Sergeant Williams called out. Take Johnson and Harris and move to the right. We'll provide cover fire. Elijah nodded, signaling to Johnson and Harris. The 3 men moved swiftly, keeping low and using the terrain to their advantage. As they approached the ridge, Elijah could see the enemy soldiers entrenched and firing relentlessly. On my mark, Elijah whispered to Johnson and Harris. Even though he had never met the 2 men before now, they hung on his words. 3, 2, 1, now! They sprang into action, firing their rifles with precision. The enemy, caught off guard, began to retreat. The men pressed forward towards the ridge, eventually securing it. Well done, men, Sergeant Williams praised them as they regrouped. We've gathered valuable intelligence and secured a key position. Let's get this information back to Captain Guerrier. As they made their way back to the forward trench, Elijah couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The mission had been a success, and they had proven their worth. But he knew this was just the beginning. The war was far from over, and many challenges lay ahead. Back at the trench, Captain Guerrier received their report with a nod of approval. You did well today, he said. Your bravery and skill have made a difference. Rest now, for tomorrow brings new challenges. Elijah and his comrades settled in for the night, the weight of their experiences heavy on their shoulders. They had faced the enemy and emerged victorious, but the true test of their resolve was yet to come. As Elijah closed his eyes, he steeled himself for the battles that lay ahead, determined to fight for a future free from tyranny. The following year unfolded in a relentless cycle for Elijah and his comrades. Night after night, they embarked on perilous missions, slipping behind enemy lines to gather crucial intelligence and then returning to report their findings to command. One fateful evening, as they prepared for another mission, Captain Guerriere approached Elijah with a grave expression. "Thompson, I have a special assignment for you and your team," he said. "We've received reports of a new German fortification being constructed just beyond the river. We need you to infiltrate the area, gather as much information as possible, and sabotage their efforts if you can." Elijah nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility. "We'll get it done, Captain," he replied confidently. Under the cover of darkness, Elijah and his team moved silently through the forest, their senses heightened by the danger that surrounded them. The sound of the river grew louder as they approached, and soon they could see the faint glow of the German encampment on the other side. "We need to cross without being detected," Elijah whispered to his team. "Follow my lead." They waded into the cold, rushing water, moving as quietly as possible. The current was strong, but they pushed forward with determination. As they reached the opposite bank, they carefully climbed out, their clothes dripping and their breath visible in the chilly night air. Elijah signaled for his team to spread out and observe the enemy fortification. For the next 2 hours, they meticulously noted the layout, the number of soldiers, and the position of the guards. Elijah's keen eyes identified a potential weak spot in the defenses, a supply depot that appeared to be the lifeline of the entire fortification. Situated on the periphery of the camp and partially concealed by a cluster of trees, it was less guarded compared to other critical areas such as the command center or the armory. The depot contained essential supplies, ammunition, rations, medical kits, and fuel, all of which were vital for the sustenance and operational efficiency of the German soldiers. With their task complete, the team began their cautious return to their trenches, moving silently through the underbrush. Suddenly, a flare shot high into the sky, casting an eerie bright light over the landscape. The flare was designed to expose any movement, making it nearly impossible for anyone to remain unseen by soldiers on both sides. As the harsh light flooded the terrain, Elijah instinctively dropped to the ground, pressing himself against the cold earth to blend into the surroundings. His heart pounded in his chest as he remained perfectly still, knowing that any movement could be fatal. Then it happened. Somewhere along the line, someone must have moved. Chaos erupted along the German lines and a barrage of gunfire shattered the tense silence. Tracer rounds lit up the night, and the air was filled with the deafening sounds of shots being fired. Elijah was stuck. He knew that getting up and running would make him an easy target, a sure death sentence. He hoped the rest of his team had the same thoughts and were staying as motionless as he was. The cacophony of gunfire and shouting was overwhelming, each shot echoing in his ears as he lay pressed against the cold, damp ground. Seconds felt like hours as he waited for the chaos to subside. His mind raced, considering every possible move and its potential consequences. Suddenly, he heard the distinct whistling sound of incoming artillery, a sound that made his blood run cold. An explosion followed, shaking the ground and sending a shockwave through his body. Dirt and debris rained down around him, and for a moment, everything went silent. Elijah's ears rang from the blast, and he struggled to regain his senses. The world seemed to move in slow motion as he cautiously lifted his head, scanning the area for signs of his team. To his relief, he spotted a few of his comrades, equally prone and motionless, their eyes wide with the same mix of fear and determination he felt. With the flare's light beginning to fade, the darkness started to reclaim the night. Elijah knew they had to move quickly before another flare was launched. He signaled to his team with a series of hand gestures, instructing them to regroup and proceed with utmost caution. One by one, they began to inch forward, using the brief moments of darkness to their advantage. The ground was uneven and littered with obstacles, but they moved silently, their training and instincts guiding them. Elijah's senses were heightened, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig setting his nerves on edge. As they neared the relative safety of their trenches, another flare shot into the sky, bathing the landscape in harsh light once more. Elijah and his team froze, their breaths shallow as they waited for the light to fade. This time, the enemy seemed less vigilant, possibly distracted by the earlier chaos. Finally, they reached the edge of their trenches. With a final sprint, they dove into the safety of the dugout, grasping for breath and hearts pounding. Elijah took a moment to count his team, relief washing over him as he realized they had all made it back. "Good job, everyone," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant sounds of the battlefield. "We did it." The team nodded, their faces showing a mixture of exhaustion and determination. It was then that Elijah noticed all the men staring at him and looking down. "What are you guys looking at?" Elijah asked, confusion etched on his face. "Your leg, man. Look at your damn leg," a soldier named Carmichael replied, his voice tinged with both concern and amazement. "How did you even make it back on that leg?" added Williams, the squad leader, his eyes wide with disbelief. Elijah mustered the courage to look down, and when he saw his leg, twisted, mangled, and soaked with blood, his vision blurred. The pain, which had been masked by adrenaline, now surged through him in waves. Before he could process it all, his world went dark, and he fainted. In the 3 months since the loss of his leg, Elijah had touched on all the emotions losing a limb would entail: anger, grief, denial, and eventually acceptance. The initial days in the field hospital were a blur of surgeries, medications, and restless nights. The physical pain was excruciating, but the emotional toll weighed even heavier on him. He felt like a part of him had been lost forever, not just his leg, but his sense of identity and purpose. Anger was the first emotion to take hold. He cursed the war, the enemy, and even his own body for betraying him. Each day he watched soldiers come and go, some with injuries less severe than his, others who never made it out of the operating room. The sight of his comrades walking on their own 2 feet filled him with a bitter resentment that he struggled to contain. Grief soon followed, a deep and hollow ache that seemed to settle in his chest. He mourned the loss of his leg, but more than that, he mourned the life he had envisioned for himself. The career in the military, the dreams of returning home a hero, all of it seemed to vanish in an instant. He cried in the quiet moments when no one was around, the tears a release for the overwhelming sadness that consumed him. Denial was perhaps the most insidious of all. Elijah would wake up some mornings momentarily forgetting the trauma he had endured. He would reach down, expecting to feel the familiar shape of his leg, only to be met with the harsh reality of his amputation. He clung to the hope that this was all a nightmare from which he would soon awake, that his leg would somehow be restored and he could return to the front lines. But as the weeks passed, acceptance began to take root. It was a slow process, marked by small milestones and moments of clarity. The support of his fellow soldiers, the unwavering dedication of the medical staff, and the quiet strength of his own resilience helped him come to terms with his new reality. He learned to navigate the world on crutches, to find new ways to accomplish daily tasks, and to redefine what it meant to be whole. Elijah often wondered what had happened to the other men in his detail and what was done with the information they had gathered on that last fateful mission. He vaguely remembered that they all had made it back alive, then nothing. But were they all still alive today? He had no way of knowing. He sat in a wheelchair as the skyline came into view. He had last seen it over a year and a half ago when he had departed for France. He was almost home. He had been on this steamer for the last month, accompanied by other damaged souls, some missing arms, some missing parts of their faces, and some missing legs like himself. As he looked around, he felt for them all. A nurse attempted to bring excitement to the men by exclaiming how wonderful the skyline was and how lucky they all were to be home. But the men were eerily silent as they all looked into the distance towards the city and the country they fought for. What would he do now? Elijah thought to himself. What could a one-legged man even do? Would there be a use for him anywhere? How would he make a living? These questions, which had been in the back of his mind for the last month, now burrowed their way to the forefront. As the ship docked and the men were helped off the vessel, Elijah felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The familiar sights and sounds of the city were both comforting and overwhelming. He had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was here, he felt unprepared. There was a crowd of people on the dock, watching anxiously yet quietly as Elijah was wheeled down the gangway. Then they erupted in cheers. Elijah was surprised. Was this for him? His smile grew and his cheeks reddened. As Elijah reached the dock, the crowd got closer, some loudly exclaiming, "Look at the hero!" Elijah braced for some sort of impact as the crowd grew nearer. Then, to his dismay, the crowd slipped past him, all in an effort to greet the soldiers behind him, who all happened to be white. Elijah found himself sitting alone as the crowd moved on. Elijah looked up at the orderly who had wheeled him down the gangway. "I'm good from here, thank you," he said. The orderly nodded and retreated. His family was waiting for him at the entrance to the dock, their faces a blend of joy and sadness. His mother rushed forward, tears streaming down her cheeks as she embraced him. "Welcome home, Elijah," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Elijah hugged her tightly, drawing strength from her presence. "It's good to be home, Mom," he replied, his voice choked with emotion. His father and siblings joined the embrace, their support palpable. They helped him into a car, and as they drove through the city streets, Elijah couldn't help but notice the changes. The city didn't feel exciting anymore. The streets were more somber than he remembered. Tears welled in his eyes as he took in the sights and smells of his home city, the neighborhoods, the people, and the changes. His senses were overwhelmed by the things he once thought he might never see again. But here they were, loud and vibrant, even though those in the car were somber and quiet. As the car approached his Brooklyn neighborhood, the first thing he saw was a large banner sprawled across the street that read, "Welcome home, Elijah, our hero." His mother turned to him and smiled as Elijah watched people stream from their homes to greet him. The car parked and Elijah was assisted out of it by his father. The crowd roared with cheers. He was quickly surrounded by all the neighborhood people he knew, hugging and shaking hands with as many as he could. In his mind, Elijah thought, "They can have the dock celebrations. I'll take my neighborhood over that any day." And so, his homecoming truly began. Thank you for listening to World War I Stories, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. I'm Henny B, your host and storyteller. Please like and subscribe, and maybe even leave a review for us wherever you find your podcasts. And join us again for more World War I stories.